We are all written by the narratives of the culture, and recognizing that, becoming conscious of how we are all swept up in certain ideas, many of them we don't even consciously recognize, can free us to some degree, at least, from those narratives that can be stifling and cruel, and not allow the self-discovery that you mentioned earlier also. There are different forms of memory that are not in the past, but allow us to make predictions about the future that are part of a continuum of living. And that's why I'm fascinated by it, right? We have some control over how we think about conscious incidents in the past. It's often a strange thing that the best works of literature for me are books in which I recognize something about my own human experience, but without the book, I couldn't have recognized it.
Hello everyone, my name is Grzegorz Jankowicz and I work as program director of the Conrad Festival. This is the last episode from the first season of interviews called The Nature of the Future. This series was created to accompany Conrad Festival, but during this year it has become an autonomous project presenting writers and their works. My guest today is Siri Hustvedt, a good friend of Conrad Festival. Hello, Siri.
Hello, nice to be with you.
It is so good to have you as a guest of Conrad this year. Siri Hustvedt is the internationally acclaimed writer, an author of 7 novels and a few collections of essays. She has also published a book of poetry and numerous papers in scientific journals. She has PhD in English literature from Columbia University. Her works were translated into more than 30 languages. In Polish, we have, I guess, all her books of fiction. The last one, Memories of the Future, premiered in our country a few weeks ago. Thank you for accepting my invitation, Siri.
Thank you for having me again.
Your writing is very diverse, both formally and thematically. Of the many themes that appear in it, I have chosen one, the gaining strength by the heroines of your works. It is strength that comes from intellect, knowledge, experience, sensitivity, and something I would call a relentless fight for independence from social constraints. It seems to me that gaining strength and liberation of the self is particularly important in your last novel, the one I've already mentioned, Memories of the Future. I would like to ask you about it today, although it won't be the only theme of this conversation. Let me start with a question about intriguing paradox that appears in the title of your work. What are memories of the future in your story, and how are the different times, past, present, and future, interconnected in the experience of the narrator and protagonist of your novel?
Yes, of course, we do not remember the future, so it is in some way nonsense. But what I was trying to get at was precisely this, that the only way we can imagine the future is through what we've experienced in the past. The novel is framed in some way as a dialogue between the older self and the younger self. The older self discovers a notebook that she wrote when she first moved to New York. She was only 23 years old. And a confrontation between the past and the present takes place in the book, between the two selves. being young, by its very nature, now that I'm old, I can say this, being young means having a very wide open future, or believing that you have that. So you are continually imaginatively filling that future space that you have as a young person. And the old narrator remembers her youth and that promise of the future with great pleasure. So in some sense, the older person is remembering the promise of the future that was in the past. So these are the complexities of it. And indeed, one of the running themes as well is that the future is a fiction. We never inhabit it, right? It is endlessly deferred. So what are we doing? We're imagining it. Now, imagination is also part of memory. We do not retrieve perfect memories from the past. There's no engram, there's no hard drive in the brain. And so over time, memories change. And they change often not consciously. We edit unconsciously. But we also are able to frame earlier experiences in a different way. So the title is complex.
And very, very inspiring. This book is also about the changes that occur over time in our psyche, our body, the way we experience ourselves, others, and the world around us. It is a story about metamorphosis, partly willed and partly inevitable, resulting from the passage of time. What is your attitude towards the changes we undergo in our lives, the changes we experience in our conscious, in our attitude towards the world and others?
Yeah, there's a philosopher of biology named John Dupre, whose work I really admire. And he talks about organisms. Of course, we're organisms too. But he says, organisms are not things, but processes, right? So I love this idea. And I think it can be genuinely applied to all living entities. That it's worthwhile to think of ourselves as not static objects, but travelers who are continually underway. This is true biologically, I think it's true psychologically, and I think it's true sociologically, right? So an openness to what I think is a truth, that we're underway rather than fixed, actually allows transformations that don't take place if you think of yourself as, I don't know, the real me, right? Many people have mythologies about themselves, and families invent mythologies about who somebody is, as if it's a static entity that moves over time. It's born and then goes through life and then dies. I think of us as much more malleable, flexible beings, and simply taking that position creates an openness to change and transformation.
The process of transformation you describe is multifaceted and involves different spheres of ourself, our existence, our experience. Our body plays a very important role in this process. While reading Memories of the Future, I remembered your former essay in which you quoted a fragment of The Phenomenology of Perception by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And here is the line: "The body's role is to ensure metamorphosis." How do you understand this line?
Well, I think, you know what, Merleau-Ponty, one of my heroes, I've quoted him a lot, talks about human beings by saying, it's not that, you know, I am, but I can, right? He's criticizing Descartes' cogito there. He's saying, it's not, you know, I think, therefore I am. It's that I can. And the can in Merleau-Ponty involves an embodied subject, right? Someone who moves through space, who does and discovers through the doing of things. And I think he doesn't denigrate what we call the mental, right? There is a psychological reality, which is why he calls people body subjects. But he doesn't divorce the body and the mind. He was very important for me because reading him helped me reorient myself in terms of body and mind.
You always pay a lot of attention to the role of the body, our organism, in all the processes we are a part of. I remember a story you told once of certain Phineas Gage. In 1849, the railroad foreman suffered an accident. A 4-foot iron rod rammed into his left cheek, blasted through his brain, and flew out through the top of his head. He survived, but he got changed.
Amazingly.
He became impulsive and aggressive. He lost his old self. This story haunted you, as you wrote, because it suggested that moral life could be reduced to a chunk of brain meat. How do you think about it today?
Well, I've learned a lot about the brain since I first read the Phineas Gage story, which is now decades ago. And it's true, it haunted me. But I have to say, the error I made in thinking about morality, which, you know, he lost his ethical sense. I mean, this is a terrible thing, is that I thought about the brain in a naive way, which is that it is not a thing that develops over time. This goes back to what we were saying. So, you know, we have innate brain structures, you know, we're born and develop in utero, you know, the brain develops. But after we're born, it continues to develop. So that what you have, and apparently, you know, the idea that this was sort of fixed, you know, or that there are parts of the brain that you can tie to certain functions is being undermined more and more. So the accumulated ethical understanding of poor Phineas Gage that can be, to some degree, located in the frontal cortices of his brain, part of that was destroyed and it changed his personality. But that is not to say that it's some kind of static entity, that, you know, a baby is born and it has its moral function here and it has its memory back there. This is not a correct way of thinking about it, but I had to learn a lot to come to that understanding, that in some way what Phineas Gage lost was also developmental time.
In your text about headaches, you wrote that migraines became part of your fate. You have adopted the position of philosophical resignation. You fought them at first, but then you accepted it. You also wrote that such view is un-American because your culture does not encourage anyone to accept adversity. Americans habitually declare war on things that afflict them. But
Yes.
in your personal experience, this change of attitude was all about getting better and at the end, stronger. It was about
Yes.
gaining strength.
Yes, I think it's really interesting. This is, of course, the case with chronic illness. If someone is facing a terminal illness, an illness that is definitely going to cause death, I think it's different. So what I have experienced since I was a child are migraines that have indeed gotten considerably better. I have them once in a while, but not chronically. Nevertheless, I felt that my migraine traveling, was one of accommodation rather than struggle. So by accommodating into my life the fact that I am a migraineur, that I suffer from this ongoing neurological trouble, in fact, made me better. Right. So, in fact, that helped to keep the illness at bay in some way. And I think this is true of many chronic illnesses, that if you accommodate it into your life, if you know that it's something that you will live with probably forever, it's infinitely better than than panicking and trying to fight it as if it's an external enemy, when in fact it is indeed part of you. And it's part of your narrative, part of the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. And that can bring strength with it. I actually have to say that I would not trade them in. The perceptual changes that migraine can produce and has produced in me frequently are interesting. There's also a sensual sensitivity that often comes with or before migraine. And that's also been interesting to me, and I think has become part of, I don't know if you'd call that character or simply bodily being, but I have sometimes wondered if it didn't affect my decision to become a writer.
The young protagonist of Memories of the Future is searching for her true self, for her writing voice. She tries to come to grips with her past, and she tries to imagine her own future, as you said. She fights for herself. She has to deal with various situations and experiences, including sexual assault. And her role model is Elsa von Freytag-Loringhofen, an artist and poet. When I found her in your novel, I was extremely happy. A year ago, we devoted a number of events at the Conrad Festival to her art and literature. We hosted Irene Gamel, her biographer, among others. How did you come across Elsa's work?
Well, I had heard about her actually when I was young, the age of my young narrator, but it was only through others. It was through Ezra Pound. She makes a brief appearance in the cantos. So, you know, my antennae went up. And William Carlos Williams, I had read about his encounters with the Baroness, but I didn't know much about her work or her poems. I invented this, that my young heroine goes to the University of Maryland, where indeed the Baroness's work was kept because they had bought the Juna Barnes collection. Not much attention was paid to her then. So it was Irene Gamel's book that I bought and read with great appreciation. And then MIT, I think Gamel's book was first, then MIT published a beautiful edition of her poems, which I read with great happiness. And then, of course, it was Gamel who first tells the Duchamp story, which is that she speculates. She doesn't say this is the absolute truth, but she speculates that the Baroness is the true author of the urinal. Now, then I started doing research into this. I met a man who has spent many, many years of his life working to get a reattribution of the urinal to Else von Freytag-Loringhoven. His name is Glyn Thompson. You can all look up his work. He's written extensively. I call him the Sherlock Holmes of the Baroness because he is determined and he's very empirical and pointed in his approach. So I was fascinated by this story and fascinated by her as a powerful woman who embodied her art as well. You know, she created herself as an art object. And Duchamp himself, I think I quote it in the book, said, you know, the Baroness is not futurism, she is the future. And indeed, in many ways, she presages what would happen later in artistic communities with performance art, especially among feminist artists, say in the 60s and 70s. Valley Export is another person who came much later, but the Baroness is the first. And she becomes an image of both insurrection, subversion, and, you know, insurrection, subversion, and revolution for the young women and the older women as well in the book, for an imaginative recreation of possibilities, right? And the first part of that is that she has to recognize her own rage and anger, right? There's a, and at one point after she's sexually assaulted, a friend of her gives her a knife and she names it the Baroness, which came to me. I actually love that. She names the knife the Baroness and carries it around with her. And it isn't until, you know, late in the book that she realizes she can give up the knife. And what is the substitute? What does she discover? It's the keys of the computer or the typewriter. But the emotional depth of the book, I think, is that she comes to recognize her anger. And you mentioned it earlier when you said the social conditions are part of the struggle as well. And in the very first paragraph of the book, the older narrator says, "What I didn't know when I was writing," she means as a young person, "is that as I wrote, I was also being written," right? So we are all written by the narratives of the culture, and recognizing that, becoming conscious of how we are all swept up in certain ideas, many of them we don't even consciously recognize, can free us to some degree, at least, from those narratives that can be stifling and cruel and not allow the self-discovery that you mentioned earlier also.
Already in The Blazing World, you presented the situation of women in the art world. You brought closer the mechanisms that make women artists marginalized in various ways. After publication of first texts about Elsa's contribution to the creation of the famous fountain attributed to Duchamp, the art world immediately began to react against this scenario. I'm not competent I'm not competent to take a solid position in this dispute.
No.
But the reactions of critics and art historians were sometimes beyond imagination. I invited an expert on Duchamp to the festival discussion on Elsa. And he replied that he would not take part in such a discussion because the whole story is untrue. And besides, Freitag Lorenhofen was an immoral person. What is the source of this panic, Siri? Why do critics and art historians react in this way?
I think there are a couple of things. It actually, I too have gotten embroiled in this to some degree. I wrote an article for The Guardian presenting my point of view with Glyn Thompson's and other scholars' work, Gamble and Thompson. So what is amusing is actually how the depths of anger about this, as you say, when you invited this person for a discussion. I think part of it is turf wars, you know, that art history is a field that guards its railings very closely, but it's also institutional because museums have invested in a lot in the replicas of the urinal that are in a number of different places. And it actually, I think if there's a reattribution, which I will go on the record saying I think there should be, because the evidence leans heavily in that direction, is that there needs then to be a certain rewriting of the history of modern art. And this is very scary, right? To have gotten it in some way wrong. I can't remember what year, it might have been 2005, a group of English, British art historians voted the urinal the most important work of modern art, period. So there's a lot hanging on this. I have to say, I respond with laughter. I also, years ago, I went to a Vermeer show and I discovered a little egg in a famous painting, Woman with the Pearl Necklace. I wrote an essay about it. And actually, while I was still in the gallery, I looked at it for 2 hours. I talked to the man who curated the show. And I said, I think that this painting is an Annunciation painting. And he looked at me like this, and I pointed to the egg and I pointed to her her position, which reminded me of certain Renaissance paintings, Italian Renaissance paintings. And later I wrote the thing in great enthusiasm. I was reconfiguring art, the art historical understanding of this painting, sent it to him. He never answered. About 2 weeks later, I see an interview with this man in a magazine in New York. And indeed, he had retracted his point of view that this was a Eucharistic painting. And he said, someone pointed out to me. Someone. He had my name. I don't know if he knew who I was, but it really didn't matter at that point. But actually, that painting is now changed its meaning, but I am never given credit for it. And I think this goes on. There's another Goya story. I have many stories, but I think art history is a particularly prickly field. And there's a lot of money and many reputations resting on that attribution. So it's going to be a wild fight. It's still going on.
In what ways does your character gain strength? You said a few things about it, about her discovery of literature, of writing, but in what ways does she gain control over what happens to her? What ultimately helps her overcome her first reaction in the face of danger, for example, which is passivity.
Yes. So I think it's a double thing, right? It's a certain ability to analyze what happened and then to relate it to the larger culture, but also to have the ability to imagine herself as someone else, right? The Baroness becomes an imaginative figure that allows her to make a turn. But after the sexual assault, she, as many people do, goes over and over and over the material. There's a kind of obsessive repetition. And I think also self-blame, which is, again, very common. And also that sense, I should have done it differently, which is certainly possible that she probably should have done it differently. But that's also part of self-blame. And in fact, of course, she is not the guilty party. It's the guy who did it who's guilty. And I think she is able to slowly recognize how the narratives, patriarchal narratives of the culture, and this includes her father, ideas of authority, all of that keeps running through the book. I mean, the most dramatic example is the violence that takes place at the very center of the book. But there's been symbolic violence taking place all the way through. And her rather comic stand is when she's at a dinner party and she's having what she feels to be a quite pleasant discussion with a philosophy professor who proceeds to condescend to her and all the other women present at the table. And her rage and anger build up to a point where she lets him have it verbally in a long speech in which she quotes Wittgenstein in both English and German. And after she's delivered this vengeful tirade, she faints. I mean, I'm sorry, I laughed very hard. For me, this is a very funny book too. Anyway, because she can't take it in a way, she can't quite face her own rage. But that's a stepping stone, right? She faints then, but the older woman who's writing in the last chapter of the book says, I don't faint anymore. And I think the ability to articulate the rage that she feels allows her, as I said earlier, to put away the knife, right? Because she can do it in other ways.
You also write, not for the first time, about the mechanisms of memory. Why are you so fascinated by memory as neurological, psychological, and cultural phenomenon?
Well, because I think, I do not think that memory constitutes the self, because, you know, there are people who have very compromised memories who nevertheless present with forms of coherence and certainly a great deal of feeling and emotional attachment. So I think it's a mistake to think of the self as merely a vehicle of memory. At the same time, we often rely on our memories in order to move forward in life, right? And they are coded both explicitly, right? In autobiographical memories, you can remember having, you know, lunch with your aunt, let's say last Thursday, and maybe looking forward to a lunch with her the next Thursday. But we also have emotional memories that may be implicit, not explicit. So I'm fascinated by that. Once I was in a bad car accident, and I had flashbacks of the accident that I do not remember. I remember everything around the accident. I do not remember the crash or the impact itself at all. But I had flashbacks for 4 nights in a row after the accident. And it was as if the accident was being reenacted. It was a fascinating experience. I'm glad it went away because it's harrowing. But that's a form of bodily memory that's very different from autobiographical memory. And then we have something that's sometimes called semantic memory. For example, if I say, what's the capital of Paris? And what's the capital of France? And you say Paris. You can't tell me where you learned that or at what moment you learned it, right? It's become part of a memory system that is just there, so there are different forms of memory that are not in the past, but allow us to make predictions about the future that are part of a continuum of living. And that's why I'm fascinated by it, right? We have some control over how we think about conscious incidents in the past. Our emotional bodily memories are more complex.
One scene of this novel is particularly touching for me. The narrator talks to her 94-year-old mother who has memory problems. She tells her about a book she's writing. The mother repeats the same questions as her brain refuses to obey. It's easy to put such an experience under the heading disease. But
Yeah.
it says something about all of us, right? About us as human beings, biological entities.
Yeah, I think that when I was writing that, my mother is now dead, but I did borrow my mother for that person. And we were very, very, we loved each other, but we were also dear friends. And our friendship developed greatly, actually, when I was in my 50s and she was in her 80s after my father died. It wasn't until she was in her 90s that she began to suffer from some dementia, which increased. She died at 96. But she retained, luckily, not all people do, she retained herself. If I can say that. She never became unrecognizable. And I felt tremendous sympathy, and it did not undermine our closeness. And because this book was about memory, having someone in my life who was losing hers seemed deeply appropriate for the narrator's adventures. And of course, many, many people have this. And I think we all have to know that in the future, this imaginary future, we could all be facing memory debilitation as well.
The narrator points out that remembering always involves the transformation of the original story. That's obvious. We add something, yeah. We subtract, we make changes more or less consciously. But the narrator adds something that fascinates me. She says that these transformations are extremely important because they can reveal the truth. This is a very inspiring approach because usually we treat any changes that appear in our memories as deformations of the truth.
That's right. I think this is an interesting, for example, in scientific papers on memory, you always see this. There's a veridical idea, right? So that if there's any distortion of the memory, it's referred to as an error, which interests me, right? Because this is how science works. There has to be this sort of real solid ground, and then you compare it. But I think actually the way we remember does carry significant emotional value that we can use, even if it's not a perfect representation of what happened, right? So we will often transfer, I mean, if you do have access to like a documentary of a memory, you will see how things change, but they do change for a reason. And this is neurobiological, even on a molecular level. They know now that memory is consolidated by emotion, and when it's reconsolidated or changed, edited, as I call it, that's also emotional. So those emotional transformations may well be a way of helping the organism or the person move forward, aiding in our survival, in fact. So poo-pooing those changes is maybe a little foolish.
Freud, quoted by you in one of your essays, claimed that we dream to protect our sleep. This is, of course, one theory out of many. Would you agree that just as dreams help us protect our sleep, literary stories help us protect our psyche in a state of conscious activity?
Yeah, of course, it depends on the literature. I mean, I guess I really do feel there's good and bad, right? There's certain kinds of stories that simply reinforce the platitudes of a given culture, right? I mean, they've always been around. And then there are stories that allow the reader or the listener to actually see the world differently. And for me, those are the ones that last, right? And that move me the most. It's often a strange thing that the best works of literature for me are books in which I recognize something about my own human experience, but without the book, I couldn't have recognized it. You know, that there's some deep recognition that takes place, but if I didn't have those words by that person in front of me, I wouldn't have been able to see it. And for me, that's the miracle of great books.
The novel is also a beautiful picture of New York at the end of the 70s. Real characters appear in it, poets, artists, musicians. I had the impression that your story is a long goodbye to the places and people who co-created that world. Yeah, it is. I mean, it was another New York that I moved to in 1978. It was a much more downtrodden, poor New York, a city that had been abandoned by 1 million inhabitants, but it was a cheaper city and a younger city, and you could still find an apartment as a poor person and not go broke. That's all changed. Manhattan is completely changed. So yes, there's early scene in the novel of walking through the streets of New York City, something I did when I first moved there. And unlike, I'm sure, many Poles and most people who visit New York, I did not know a single living soul. I actually had no contacts, no phone numbers, no one to call. So my first weeks in New York were spent walking and reading in the city, but it was a grand experience, and some of the friendships I made then have
I've kept. And we all feel a tremendous fondness for that period of our life, or our lives.
One of the persons you say goodbye to in the novel is John Ashbery. His poems, along with those of other New York school poets, are quite well known in Poland. Was his work important to you?
His work was so important to me. I spent a lot of time reading, studying, and working on Ashbery's poems. I was writing poems at the time, and the New York school was a revelation to me. I did attend the poetry reading at the Ear Inn, and many other poetry readings during that time of my life. It was extremely exciting, I have to say, and I loved it. I loved it, and I got to know Ashbery later as an older person. My husband knew him, and we were introduced many times. And John never paid any attention to me, and I always thought, but I'm your greatest fan. And then at one dinner, I started to talk about something, and suddenly John looked at me, and it was like recognition, I don't know, of some internal properties that I guess he had missed for many years, and we became friends after that. He was a deeply charming and funny person, as well as a great poet.
Barbara Guest, who was also a member of the New York School of Poetry, is the least known in Poland. It should be changed. At the beginning of the book, the narrator confesses that she bought Guest's book because she was intrigued by the phrase used by the poet. And here is the line, understand the distance between characters. Yeah. The narrator writes that she is still trying to do this, to understand this distance between characters. Where does this distance between characters come from? And what does understanding mean in this context?
Yeah, well, I love that phrase, and I love her work. And I do agree that I think because she is a female member of the New York School, she has been left out far too often. She's a great poet. This fascinated me because I have to say, theoretically, for many, many years, I have been fascinated by exactly this. How do we formulate or think about the between, right? The distance between, well, characters, self and other. What is the meaning of this? It, of course, has been formulated by various philosophers that I care about. Martin Buber calls it the between. The Jewish theologian and philosopher Merleau-Ponty talks about the between without calling it that. And of course, Husserl and the idea of the intersubjective. So philosophically, this is a fascinating terrain to explore. I love Guest's phrase because she uses the word characters as well, which evokes fiction, which evokes, of course, there are characters in our lives, but there's a certain ambiguity to the terminology that can place it inside a literary work, either a poem or a novel. And negotiating the distance between characters is something I think we all do all of our lives.
I'm writing not only to tell, I'm writing to discover. These words appear in Memories of the Future. Your discoveries, Siri, also painful ones, become part of the reader's experience. And I want to thank you so much for that and for today's interview.
Well, thank you. I had a lot of fun, which, you know, is just great. Thank you for your really penetrating and interesting questions that made me excited and happy.
Thank you so much. Let me give one information to our audience. Dear all, as I said at the beginning, this is the last interview of the first season of the Nature of the Future series. I'm planning the next season, and if nothing gets in the way, we will see each other in a few months. Now I wish us all that the next year will bring us some relief we so desperately need it. And I wish us all to be stronger. Siri, thank you again, and see you soon.
Yeah, I'm really grateful that you included me. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye.